We're going to return to our top story now and those violent protests in Ukraine. And to discuss developments in Ukraine, I have European Parliament member Libor Roucek. He's in Brussels, and in Belgrade, Srdja Trifkovic. He's a writer on international affairs and foreign affairs, editor of the US-based Chronicles magazine. Well, we'll start off with you, Libor Roucek, here in Brussels. Your parliamentary group has expressed, and I quote here, full support and solidarity with the peaceful protesters in Kiev. So what do you make of the protests now that they have got extremely violent there?
Exactly. We have expressed our support for peaceful demonstrations. As we know, for more than a month, there were mainly peaceful demonstrations. Yes, yesterday there was violence. We strongly condemn the violence. And I would also say it's a bit unfair what your TV is presenting to your viewers, because you show violence, you say this is the opposition. Opposition wants to overthrow the government, and it's supported by the European Union. So it's not the way. We don't support the violence, but we do support, of course, not only in Ukraine, not only in Europe, everywhere in the world, peaceful expression.
The EU has been very critical of Yanukovych.
Human rights.
The EU has been very critical of Yanukovych and his anti-protest laws, but he says they are in line with European standards. So why should Europe criticise him the way that the police are handling the situation, where it appears they were certainly outnumbered last night and inflicted heavy casualties?
The changes that happened on the 17th of January in Verkhovna Rada, this is not in European, in accordance with European guidelines. What is needed is dialogue. The dialogue is needed, of course, in Verkhovna Rada, in the parliament, and especially is needed between the government and the opposition, the representatives of the opposition who are present in the parliament. And through the dialogue, everything has to be discussed, not through the violence.
Let me ask Srdja Trifkovic.
As I said, we condemn the violence, not only my political group. Today there was a meeting of foreign affairs ministers, and
thank
same
you.
decision, we don't support the violence.
Let's hear now from Srdja Trifkovic. Who then do you think is to blame for this outbreak of violence? The Ukrainian government by failing to meet the people's demands because people are clearly unhappy with the government at the moment, or is it the opposition simply failing to keep control of the crowds it's encouraging?
Well, it's worse than that, because now we are dealing with a significant group of highly committed people who are hell-bent on regime change through street thuggery. And by the way, the Ukrainian legislation on limiting so-called freedom of assembly is no worse than the recent Spanish law, about which your own station reported 6 weeks ago. In fact, what we are dealing with is a clear attempt to undermine the constitutional order of a major European state, and it is truly shocking for European parliamentarians to say that they're still supportive of a process that obviously wants to use street thuggery and mob rule as a means of regime change. Because if you claim that Yanukovych has lost legitimacy, what about Silvio Berlusconi, who was under criminal investigation for the best part of 10 years that he was in power as Italy's prime minister?
All right, well, let me quickly ask Libor. Let me quickly ask Libor. Regime change, a change of government, that's exactly what the EU wants. It wants influence over Ukraine in the long term. It's not the economic aspirations of the government. It's actually expansion towards the east, and it wants control.
It's not the case.
Carry on.
No. We had presidential elections in Ukraine 4 years ago. We had other elections. These elections were recognized as free and fair. If there has to be a change of government, it has to be done through the elections. That's the principle of the European Union, and we support that. You mentioned Spain, whether it's Spain, Greece, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, any other country. These are the principles.
Srdja, exactly. Why aren't the protesters waiting for that democratic process? Why aren't the protesters waiting for that democratic process? There's an election due, spring 2015.
Well, first of all, because they were encouraged by the presence of former German... I was hoping to get a word in.
That's exactly our
they
message.
were encouraged by the presence of the former German Foreign Minister Westerwelle at the barricades, and Victoria Nuland from the State Department passing cookies around. Now, can you imagine Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov going to Barcelona to support Catalan separatists. Can you imagine a Belarusian foreign minister going to Scotland, to Glasgow, to support Scottish separatists? It's unthinkable. We are looking at fundamentally flawed concept of dual standards. And when it comes to Ukraine, what we have witnessed is excessive patience by the government at street thuggery and the rule of mob. This would not have been allowed in Washington, D.C., it would not have been allowed in London, and certainly not in Brussels.
Libor, let's hear you respond to that.
I hope you will let me also to speak, let me to finish what I'm saying. What was the reasons for the demonstrations? The reason was that President Yanukovych, the Ukrainian authorities, refused at the last moment, under the pressure of Moscow, under the pressure of Russia, refused to sign the association and free trade agreement. That's what brought the, let me to talk. Let me to finish it. What I'm saying. That was the reason what brought the people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to the street. Because that was the consensus in the Ukraine. The Russian authorities for more than a year were negotiating the association agreement. Then under the pressure of Moscow,
was no consensus in Ukraine.
Under the threats, under the threats of cutting off the gas, we know it, and it was confirmed by the Ukrainian authorities.
No, we don't know. Excuse me.
You are the trade between Ukraine and. Let me to finish what I'm saying.
You are making factual claims that are incorrect. I'm sorry, you're making factual claims that
Ukrainian
are incorrect.
Authorities were,
all right, okay, Libor, apparently you are making claims that are incorrect. Srdja, what are those claims then? Those factual claims
we cannot have a debate on these terms.
You put those facts right then, Srdja, from what you see then. Why is Libor wrong about this?
Went to the street.
We are looking at a clear-cut situation where Yanukovych was perfectly within his rights to say no to a horrible deal which, had it gone ahead, would have cost Ukraine tens of billions of euros, which it cannot afford, when Russia came in with 15 billion rescue package, and it's simply that Europe wanted to have free access to the Ukrainian market for nothing, and it was geopolitical all along. They were really trying to stab Russia in its soft underbelly for nothing, and they lost.
Okay, Srdja, can I just quickly ask you?
They lost, that's it.
All right, but of course, all these protests now seem not to be about the European issue. They're about a dissent and an anger with the Ukrainian government. Now, the EU are saying they want to see the will of the Ukrainian people being represented there in those protests. Is that the will of the Ukrainian people being represented there?
Absolutely not. This is the will of a small group of highly committed nationalist activists.
Can you?
All right, we cannot talk at the same time. This is no debate, this is just a shouting match.
We have a slight problem with the delay from Brussels, so it's very difficult for Libor to cut in and then obviously for us to pick up on that. But just very briefly, I just want a statement from both of you. Srdja, your closing comments then on what you believe is going to be the outcome and why it's happened, just briefly.
The outcome will be that most Ukrainians will realize which side their bread is buttered, and that the deal with Russia, connected not only with economics, but with long-term traditional, spiritual and cultural links, makes it imperative for Ukraine to keep its equidistance vis-à-vis Europe and Russia, and not to become part of a camp which looks upon Ukraine as a tool of geopolitical long-term game of surrounding and strangling Russia, which is bad for Ukraine, bad for Russia, and bad for Europe.
Final word then from Libor Roucek, please, in Brussels there.
It's absolute nonsense. It's absolute rubbish. It's up to the Ukrainian people to decide what do they want, whether they want the associations agreement or whether they want closer relations with Russia. President Yanukovych had the mandate to negotiate the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, association agreement. At the last moment, under Russian pressure, he withdrew from that, and that's the reaction of the Russian people.
No, he didn't.
As I said, we are against violence, so let's negotiate, let's have a dialogue, let's have a roundtable in Kiev. But you know, as I said, that was the cause of the demonstration. Now there is violence. We reject violence, but we want dialogue.
All right.
And it is entirely due to the demonstrations
by Ukrainians. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide what do they want.
All right, thank you, Libor Roucek, member of the European Parliament live there in Brussels, and Srdja Trifkovic, writer on international affairs in Belgrade. Thank you very much, and apologies for the slight sound delay, which of course made that debate quite difficult to follow at times. But thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input.